Tonight's event is the featured program in the 2024-25 Jerome H. Garris Dialogue Series, dedicated to modeling thoughtful, evidence-based conversation across perspectives. Over the past 15 years, states like Texas and Florida have experienced rapid population growth, while states like California and New York, known for their strong social safety nets, have seen significant outmigration. What's behind these trends? Are red state policies on taxes, labor, and regulation more attractive, or are blue state investments in education and healthcare still viable models? These questions are at the heart of ongoing national debates on economic growth, inequality, and the role of government. To help us understand these shifting dynamics, we are joined by Professors Shauna Rose and Ken Miller, both experts in state and local politics here at CMC. Professor Shauna Rose is the Alice Tweed Toohey Associate Professor of Management and Government and Director of the Public Policy major. Her research focuses on federalism, healthcare, policy, and minimum wage politics, and she's the author of Responsive States and Financing Medicaid. Her next book, On the Politics of the Minimum Wage, is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press. Professor Ken Miller is the Don H. and Odessa Rose Associate Professor of State and Local Government and Director of the Rose Institute. He has written widely on direct democracy, constitutional law, and political polarization, and is the author of Texas versus California, which explores how these two states have come to symbolize America's red and blue divide. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by Professor Eric Helland, the William F. Podlick Professor of Economics and George R. Roberts Fellow. A leading scholar in law and economics, Professor Helland's research spans elections, litigation, and judicial behavior. Together, they'll explore how different state policy models are shaping economic and social outcomes, and what these laboratories of democracy might tell us about America's future. Please remember to silence your cell phones and refrain from recording or taking photos during the event. With that, please join me in welcoming Professor Shauna Rose, Ken Miller, and Eric Helland to the Athenaeum. Thank you.
So while our panelists are coming up, I'm just going to grab the mic for 1 second and just say a few words about the person for whom this lecture is named, Jerry Garris. Jerry was a friend of mine. I worked closely with Jerry sort of over the years. I just want to tell one very short story so I don't take too much of our time. When I was, I believe, an assistant professor, I had come back from my parents' house, and as an assistant professor, going to visit your parents is the time when you get a lot of work done. And so somebody else is playing with the kids. This was pre-cloud computing, so I had all of my hard drives and laptop, and I wired them all together, came to a meeting at the Ath, and someone drilled a hole in the wall of Bauer, which you may not know is a giant asbestos trap. And poor Jerry had to close down Bauer, and none of us could get in. All of my work is there, and just by misfortune, I am the one person who has nothing. I am completely shut down, and I'm an assistant professor. And Jerry handled it with his usual grace and dedication. He got the building back open as quickly as he could. But I think I complained a little more than, usual for me. And Jerry, being a very, very nice guy, took that all in stride. But once we were back in the building, Jerry called me and he said, "Hey, Penny and I would like to buy you and your wife a night at the Hollywood Bowl, just to thank you for how much of an inconvenience this was." He didn't have to do that, and it meant the world to me that he took the moment to sort of recognize what sort of a shock this was for an assistant professor. So I want to just raise a glass of whatever you're drinking to Jerry Garris, a man who embodies all or most of the traits that I love about CMC. To Jerry. Thank you.
Sure.
So with that, I'm going to keep the microphone, and I swear I will not be talking this much, although I believe there's a bet of the panelists as to how quickly I just join the panel and sort of start in. So I want to start this with 2 slides and a puzzle. So this is the first slide, and this is productivity. And for those of you that have had Econ 50, you will know that kind of the norm is for people to migrate to places that have higher productivity, right? The idea is that you go someplace where your wages will be higher, where your standard of living will be higher. And if you looked at that, that says that California, New York, and Massachusetts are the places where productivity is sort of growing the fastest. But what do we actually see? Well, thank you. What do we actually see? Exactly the opposite. Those are places losing population at sort of a much higher rate than other places in the country. And so, in fact, what happens?
It's an inside joke.
If you know, you know. So the idea here is that this is a puzzle. And so one way I think that we should sort of start this is to kind of begin the puzzle with what's sort of going on, right? Why are people sort of moving in that direction? So I want to start this then with a question to I'm just going to call you Ken and Shauna because I have to keep remembering, so no one feels scandalized. So Ken, most people may not know this, but you're California born and bred. You were educated here, you grew up here. Your only sort of detour is a brief stint in another blue state, Massachusetts. But what people may not understand is that you and California almost broke up. There was a period where you went to Texas, and all of us were very worried. But you seem to have patched it up with California and sort of come back. Yep. So I think you're the perfect person to start this off with, which is, why are people leaving?
Well, thanks, Eric, and thanks everybody for coming out. And I want to thank the Garris family as well for the chance to honor Jerry tonight. I guess I'd begin by saying it's even more of a puzzle to me if you think about the qualities of this state, of the state of California. It is, to my mind, I've been in, I think, 46 states, something like that. And I haven't yet been to one that's more beautiful, that has better weather, that is has more sort of cultural attractions, diversity of cultural attractions and culture in general. It's a remarkable place, right? You would expect, not only because of economic productivity and the economic models, just because of the many, many attractions of this state, that people would be clamoring to come here as opposed to exiting. And what we've seen is and we'll talk a little bit more about this, for much of California's history, we got what you would expect, which is mass influx of population into the state from other parts of the United States. This was like the golden state, the destination where people wanted to come. But really since the 1990s, and we can talk about more about why that was, but starting in the 1990s, we started to see more net migration out of California to other states, as opposed to into California. And I think the principal reason for that is that the state got built out in terms of housing, in terms of these suburbs and the major metropolitan areas. Growth was high, and there was actually a political consensus started to grow, led by a governor named Jerry Brown in the 1970s, that we had reached an era of limits, and that we were testing the limits of what the environment could endure in terms of new construction and building and so forth. New legislation was passed, including something called the California Environmental Quality Act, and other laws that made it more difficult to continue building roads and aqueducts and new housing construction. And so the capital expended in California to make it the kind of place that would attract people sort of dried up. And so there was a continuing population growth that tended to be international immigration from Latin America and Asia in the 80s and 90s. But we finally reached a point by the late teens, or early 2020s, where our population has totally flatlined. Okay, we were expected to get over 40 million and keep growing. The state's demographers expected that to continue. But what in fact happened is that we never quite reached 40 million, and we dropped down closer to 39 million, and we're flat, okay? And so I would say that the biggest reason why that has happened and why population is moving out of California, and even more importantly, maybe not moving into California from other places, is that it's too expensive to buy here because we didn't continue building more housing, more infrastructure to accommodate more population. Supply and demand just dictates that we can't, that most people can't afford to live here. Now, there are a few people who can pay a premium to be here. That's why we're a high productivity state, is because we have Silicon Valley, we have other sort of these clusters where knowledge workers can come and do very well and make a lot of money and live in very nice neighborhoods and enjoy the Pacific Ocean and all of that. But if you're not sort of well-trained and well-educated and well sort of resourced in that way, this is a prohibitively expensive place to live, and that's why people leave.
So two bits of evidence. This is a survey that was done by Axios. So it's always good as an economist, I just felt necessary to put up things confirming. And then I thought this was also interesting. This kind of gets at your sort of point, which is, sort of who's leaving. And, to your point, it's definitely sort of people on the lower end of the economic spectrum. So Sean, I'm going to turn to you and say, who cares? So, we have people leaving. They're exiting an expensive place. Why do we care?
Yeah, I think we should care for a bunch of reasons. I think it's helpful to kind of break them into categories. So if we think about the economic impact, the budgetary impact, and the political impact. And the first two, it really depends actually who's leaving. And then the third one, it doesn't matter as much because that's the Electoral College. So the first two, if we think about the potential economic impact, if these trends continue, it really matters who's leaving, because people are good for the economy. They produce stuff, they buy stuff, they generate activity. And when they leave, they take most or all of that activity with them. And so the question is, are the most productive people leaving, the highest earners, the people with college degrees? And there was sort of anecdotal or media sort of portrayals of who was leaving around the time of the pandemic that really emphasized sort of the remote worker was leaving and they were going to Texas or they were going to Idaho, and we were, losing these very productive college-educated, high-wage workers. That turned out to be a pretty temporary blip, actually. And now it seems like more recent trends suggest that it's primarily low and middle income earners without college degrees who are leaving. We'll have to see, if that trend continues. But for now, that bodes better for our economy than if our more productive workers were leaving. Second, if we think about the state budget, it's a similar story. California, we'll get into tax policy in a few minutes, but California has arguably the most progressive tax structure in the country. We have the highest top marginal tax rate of 13.3%. And so our tax system is very sensitive to anything going wrong with those top earners. If they have a bad year, if they leave, that can really hurt our revenue base. So again, that doesn't seem to be happening right now. And then the third is the political implications. And if current trends continue through the 2030 census, California is on track to lose 4 seats in the Electoral College. Texas will gain several states. Your head is blocking it.
There we go.
4 states. 4 votes in the 4 seats in Congress, 4 Electoral College votes. Florida will gain. New York will lose. It's a net of about 12 blue seats being lost and replaced by 12 additional red seats. And so that really changes the electoral math for the Democratic Party. These folks leaving for places like Texas probably are not enough to swing those states. And so what it means is bad news for the Democratic Party for the most part.
Ken, I want to turn to you. Is this unprecedented? Have we been here before?
Yeah, so I mentioned the 20th century in California. California increased population, get the next slide there, dramatically. California is the blue line on the graph. This is showing from statehood, 1850, up through the 2020 census. And so you can see that for much of that time, almost all of that time, New York was the largest population state in the United States. California passed New York in the 1960s. as it went on that very steep upward trend line after World War II, population growth in California. Texas was, during the 19th century, had more population than California, but in the 20th century, it continued to grow at a fairly good clip, but nothing like California. The one I want to emphasize in terms of, have we seen this before? I think it's New York State. That's what I think California is becoming like. So why do I say that? New York was, for much of its history, absolutely this population leader, but also the economic dominant state, politically important in Congress with the most members of Congress and electoral college votes and all of that. But about the 1960s and 70s, it started flatlining in terms of population. Okay, so if you look at that, it reached, that's 20 million, nearly 20 million, and it's still that today. So it hasn't grown in population nearly at all in the last half century. And that's what I expect may well happen with California for the reasons I said earlier, is that we may just flatten out and we'll be passed up probably by Texas within about 25, 30 years. It'll be the most populous state in the nation. And so California's long run as the most populous state will come to an end. What will that mean for California? It will still be like New York, which is a high population, influential, wealthy, high productivity state, right? There'll be lots of reasons why it's important, but it's not going to be as important comparatively as it has been heretofore, because other states, not only Texas, but Florida and other places that are gaining population will gain political power, will gain economic power as corporate headquarters increasingly move to these places. There's just more concentration of people and economic power in those other places. So this is not new. There's been movement of people internally within the United States throughout our history. And what we're observing is that the state California, which had been the major destination state, is no longer that. And so it's now moving to Texas and Florida and Tennessee and places like that.
So I'm going to ask you a follow-up question on this, because there's nothing, this isn't a law of physics that the largest state has to sort of decline, right? There are policy choices behind this. And so what I want us to do now is to go through a couple of these policy choices and kind of ask what the sort of net effect was on this, right? On the quality of life, on where people live, sort of more generally on kind of what we see in the future. I want to start with tax policy, right? And there's a typical characterization that you will hear about California versus Texas, that Texas is low tax, California is high tax. But it's in fact actually a lot more interesting than that in many ways, right? It's sort of how. So Ken, I just wanted to sort of turn to you and kind of talk a little bit about kind of what's going on with sort of tax rates in California and how California versus Texas, and really I think this is also true of Florida, New York, and others, how the tax system sort of varies between the two.
Yeah, so just a little bit of context. So states get most of their money from one of three sources, or two or three of three sources, which is income tax, personal income tax, on top of your federal income tax, right? The second one is the sales tax, and the third one is property tax. Okay, those are the three major sources. There's additional sources as well that kind of round out state budgets and local budgets, but those are the big ticket items. So some states rely more heavily on one of those sources than others. Part of the reason Texas has a reputation of a low tax state is because it has a zero state income tax. You can see that on the map. These are the light colored states. So it also includes Florida, Tennessee now, it recently went to zero state income tax, and a couple of those mountain states, right? Those also happen to be big destination states for Californians, because a lot of California taxpayers don't like having to pay that additional income tax on top of their federal taxes, right? Now, to Eric's point, states have to raise revenue somehow, so if there's zero income tax, they have to find alternative sources. So in Texas, they actually have a higher property tax rate than California. So how could that be? Texas has a higher tax rate than California. It's partly there's a historical reason for that. California voters in 1978 passed a statewide constitutional amendment called Proposition 13, which caps the property tax at 1% of the property's value. There can be a little bit of add-on top of that if voters support that. And even maybe more importantly for a lot of homeowners, the assessed value of the property cannot go up more than 2% per year. Even if the actual market value is going up like this, the property tax value stays low, right? Okay, so that's why California has lower property tax than Texas. Now, there is a little bit, I mean, there's complication on complication, which is that's a rate, right? But it's a rate times the value of the house. And California houses are about 2 to 3x what Texas houses are. So if you multiply the rate times the value of the house, actually California property taxes are higher than you might expect given their low rates, right? And so if you look at states in general, all of them have to collect sufficient revenue to provide services, and they make different choices. Now, the different choices matter, right? Because the income tax is the most progressive, especially the way we do it in California, that we tax the highest income people at the highest rate. It's a graduated income tax. And so you're paying 13.3% if you're in the highest tax bracket. If you're in a lower tax bracket, you pay much less in terms of income tax, right? In Texas, with zero income tax, they rely on property and sales taxes, which tend to be more regressive, especially the sales tax. And so that's that chart up there. If you are a top 1%er in Texas, then your sort of combined tax is a lot lower than if you're in a top 1%er in California, right? So there's not only overall tax revenue coming to the state that's important, but also who pays and how much.
So Sean, I'm going to turn, we talked about volatility already, so I wanted to actually go ahead and turn to spending and kind of ask you, like, what is this buying?
Well, can I actually say one thing about
Please
taxes
do.
before we move on?
Yeah,
Well, actually,
absolutely.
I might even say two things.
Okay, please.
Yeah. First, if you think about this graph and then you kind of superimpose the one about who's leaving, you realize a lot of the people who might be leaving California for Texas are getting kind of a raw deal, right? Because you don't actually do better in Texas if you're on the lower end of the income distribution. The other thing I would say, if you can go back 2 slides to the income tax. So California, in addition to taxing ordinary income at the highest marginal tax rate of any state in the country, also happens to tax capital gains as ordinary income. A lot of states don't tax capital gains at higher rate, they have a lower rate. And so what that means is it's very, very volatile. When your tax base is primarily income and capital gains, those things move around a lot more than home values, right? So California, this all kind of adds to the sensitivity of California's revenue base, which I was mentioning earlier. There's one estimate that when Elon Musk left California, it cost the state about $500 million just in capital gains taxes. Forget all the other revenue losses associated with his departure. So it's really a big problem for California to lose very wealthy, although whatever you want to think about Elon Musk and whether you want him in California, it hurts our revenue quite a great deal. Okay, so you had a question about
So
spending.
I did. I just was going to ask you what all this bought,
Right.
right? Yeah. What are the differences? So we have a higher tax rate. We have more taxes, sort of total in California. Blue states generally. I think it's also true of New York, Massachusetts,
Yeah.
Florida, and Texas less. What's the sort of difference? What services are you buying for that extra money?
Yeah, we spend more in California. We spend more. The main things we spend money on in any given state, but especially in California, is health and K through 12 education. So those two things together make up about 50% of the budget of the typical state. Medicaid is close to 30%. Now that varies wildly, right? This is an average. But in California, one of the things our tax dollars plus the federal funding that we get for Medicaid pay for is a much more generous Medicaid program. Medicaid, of course, being the program for low-income Americans, traditionally pregnant women, children, parents and elderly and disabled, although we'll talk about the Medicaid expansion in a moment, which extended eligibility to adults who might not have a dependent child at home or might not be disabled, for example. And so California and New York have much more generous Medicaid programs than most red states. Partly that's because they have chosen to do the Affordable Care Act's Medicaid expansion. Partly it's because they have chosen to exceed federal eligibility guidelines for pregnant women and children and other groups. Part of it is actually, in the case of California and New York, both offer Medicaid to undocumented immigrants. They're two of the only states to do that. And so that costs a lot of money. In fact, it was recently announced that California has a Medicaid budget deficit that Governor Newsom acknowledges is at least partially driven by the unexpectedly high cost of Medicaid for undocumented immigrants. Same thing's happening in Illinois right now. And so it pays for more, better healthcare is one of the things. If you want to go one or two, this is showing the states that adopted the Medicaid expansion, Texas and Florida, two of the states that did not do so. So that means that it's cheaper in those states, right? That's money that's not being spent on healthcare. Can you go one more? Texas has by far the highest uninsured rate in the country. There are a lot of uninsured people. And you may not know this, but US News and World Report does not just rank colleges, they also rank states. And they rank states on things like public health. And so the states that have expanded Medicaid beyond what they're required to do have lower uninsured rates. These rankings are actually based on things like mortality, infant mortality, adult obesity, smoking, mental illness, suicide rates. And we see blue states, many with very generous Medicaid programs, being in the top 5. And I was hoping to prove my point that Texas and Florida would be in the bottom. It didn't work out that way. They're kind of in the middle, so just put that under the rug. But anyway, these are all red states that are in the bottom 5. And so I think one thing it might buy is better health. On the other hand, education, we also spend more on education than states like Texas and Florida, but it's not as clear what we're buying in that case. So if we think about the spending rate, you can see California spends more, other blue states spend more, New York and so forth. But if we look at test scores, it's not clear that throwing more money at education necessarily increases test scores. There's a huge empirical literature trying to figure out why this is the case. Of course, there are a lot of other things that go into test scores, such as socioeconomic characteristics. Of course, the pandemic was a big shock that may have differentially affected states that locked down for longer and shorter periods. And so we don't necessarily see better educational outcomes as measured in this very imperfect way of test scores.
So I want to turn now, I mean, so just to summarize just for a second for the audience. So what we have at the moment is people are leaving California. It's a lovely place with great weather, high productivity. It has better healthcare, not particularly better or worse sort of educational outcomes. So we still kind of don't have an answer to our puzzle yet. So I want to turn to labor, and I'm going to start, Ken, with you, and that is I want to talk a little bit about unions. Now, one interesting feature of this is union support looks very different across the country, but I think it also manifests itself differently kind of across red and blue states in terms of how it sort of plays out in the policy process. So I thought I'd just turn it to you and kind of ask what's driving that sort of union divide?
Yeah, so one of the interesting features of a federal system like ours is that you can get major variation in policy at the subnational level. And so we've seen it in taxes, right, where some states can have 0 income tax and other states can have 13.3%, right? And labor is another area where, Medicaid is another one, right? We talked about Medicaid expansion, but labor is another one. And for many decades, Congress has allowed there to be variation in the way in which states either facilitate or make it more difficult for unions to organize to strike, both private sector unions and also public sector unions, okay? And so what you'll see here, I think this is a union density or union membership rate by state. And so if you can see the legend down here, the state with the most union density is New York, and California and the Pacific Northwest are sort of in the upper half. But you'll also see, I think, and the states with the crosshatch are the lower states, and then the states with no markings on them are at the bottom, okay, in terms of union membership or union density. You'll also note, I think, that this tracks very closely with red-blue state divide, right? And it's part of the explanation, which maybe we'll talk about at the end, is how is it that these states divided red and blue the way they have? If you look at a map of the United States from a century ago, or even more recently than that, a lot of these colors would flip. So for most of its history, California was a Republican state. And for almost all its history, Texas was a Democratic state, right? And as you know, there was realignment, political realignment throughout the South, where historically Democratic states, solid Democratic South, became Republican. And in the Northeast, Upper Midwest, West Coast, states that had historically, starting with the Civil War and Lincoln, been Republican, became Democrat at the end of the 20th century, right? And so what explains that? One of the explanations is that those, what are currently blue states, were pro-union. And that has had important political effects in terms of support for the Democratic Party over time. And the states that were anti-union are the states that historically were Southern Democrat but are now Republican, okay? And so that has importance in terms of the political culture and organizational structure and things like that for states. And I'll just speak a little bit about California. Probably the most important single constituency within the Democratic Party in California is organized labor. And of that is probably public sector unions. And within that, it's California's Teachers Association, right? You could create these hierarchies, but it's organized labor plays an incredibly important role in the political process in California. If you're a Democrat and you cross unions, then you got a problem, right? And so unions have a lot of power. If you're in Texas and you cross unions, it's not a big deal. And especially with respect to public sector unionization. Public school teachers are, as I say, a very powerful union interest in California. In Texas, they are not legally allowed to organize and strike. In fact, if they strike, they get fired and they lose their pensions. Okay, there are these associations of teachers in Texas, but they're not unions, right? And so you see, it's a very big difference that helps explain the red-blue divide. It really helps explain why California politics is different from Texas politics.
Shauna, you literally wrote the book on minimum wages. So I'm going to turn to you, but I'm going to phrase this question in a slightly different way, which is I think a lot of blue state policy seems to me, as the non-state and local person up on stage, as kind of protecting people from the kind of other parts of the policies, right? So higher housing costs and so on. What's interesting to me, since I spent an entire section of my intro econ class talking about why minimum wages are such a bad idea, is how much blue states have embraced the minimum wage. So what gives?
Well, I think it's partly what Ken said, which is the role of unions. And unions in recent decades, and in any case, have pushed pretty hard. They've been one of the big forces behind minimum wages in the state, especially in the blue states. And so there is this idea in sort of Econ 101 that minimum wages are bad for business, they're bad for the economy, which is a big reason why red states have mostly resisted them. It's mostly been debunked. The evidence on minimum wages killing jobs is mixed, but most studies find negligible to or minimal effects. Instead, it seems to be that employers are mostly just passing the higher labor costs along to consumers in the form of higher prices, at least in less than perfectly competitive markets. And so what we have is, basically employers making the case that this is going to kill jobs, but it's not borne out by the evidence. Meanwhile, it does seem to be a pretty effective way to reduce poverty and inequality. David Otter is an MIT economist who was here at the Athenaeum earlier this spring, and he's got some research showing that something like 30 or 40% of the increase in income inequality in the United States can be traced to the stagnation of the federal minimum wage, which has been stuck at $7.25 for a very, very long time. And so states are kind of trying to fill in that void of federal leadership, or at least blue states are. The other thing that's interesting from a political standpoint is the role of direct democracy here. And we see, states like Florida and Missouri that you wouldn't think of as being on the forefront of the minimum wage movement. And the reason is that they did it through ballot measures. And labor unions, again, as Professor Miller was saying, were behind these efforts to take it straight to the voters. Minimum wages are very popular with voters for the most part. And so that's how states like Missouri and Florida have managed to do it despite the resistance of their Republican leaders. The last thing I'll just point out, one thing that happened that was really interesting in the most recent election here in California is that California voters narrowly rejected a minimum wage increase to $18. And I really think, the narratives sort of the post, election narrative has really been voters are worried about those price increases. We've had a lot of inflation recently, and voters are increasingly aware of what fast food restaurants in particular are doing. They're passing it along in the form of higher prices. If you've been to a fast food restaurant recently in California, the prices are not what they used to be. And so there may be a sense in which some states, and something similar happened in Massachusetts, although it was more complicated than just that. But they had a ballot measure fail as well. So there seems to be a limit to what blue states are wanting to do in the minimum wage department.
So since no one was scandalized by the minimum wage discussion except the economist on stage, I'm going to turn to something more controversial, Ken, and talk about housing. And so you actually mentioned this, which is, we've had this pretty dramatic increase in housing prices over the period kind of from the 90s sort of on. And I guess my first question to you is, why don't we build enough houses? And I know you just had a Rose conference on this.
Yeah, we did
We
last
wait
week
for the answer.
Right. First, you should scoot back so people can see the median home value in California, which is $900,000. Median, folks. And Claremont's a little north of that. It's a little over $1 million median value. Okay, so you guys are, going to be successful economically, most of you, and you're probably going to be able to, after some period of time, be able to afford a house. But a lot of your contemporaries are not in the same advantageous position, and unless they've got parental support or they win the lottery or something like that, $1 million is a big number, right? If you think about what you need for a down payment and then monthly payments, and on top of that you need home insurance, and it's like a big burden. And so home ownership is out of reach of a lot of people, right? And so I just want to emphasize that. That's one of the biggest things that prevents people from staying in California or moving here from other states, right, is housing costs. There are other costs, taxes, I would say those are secondary really to the housing cost situation. All right, so if you look at Texas, it's sort of light green, it's less than half the housing cost. And so if you just, twice or half, right? So a lot of people are making that calculation and deciding to move on that basis, right? Why is it so expensive to build houses? So Professor Helen Eric turned me on to a RAND study that came out this week, I think, last week? I don't know.
Last week.
Last week, all right. So just saying, citing some of the statistics, they compared California, Colorado, and Texas, but a lot of the most dramatic contrasts were between California and Texas. And to build new housing, it's 2.3 times more expensive. So that's the cost. Why is it more expensive? The cost of land is more expensive. We don't have as much sort of available land. If you go to Dallas, there's sort of like open space all the way to Oklahoma City, right? You could just kind of keep expanding out with relatively cheap land. And if you think about California in the 1950s, like this whole area was orange groves. You could plow them under and put up relatively inexpensive housing, right, in Southern California. And now it's either totally built out or is protected by the Coastal Zone Act or CEQA. And the kind of housing that happens now is infill development of multi-unit housing. You're not getting sort of like the big backyard and the swimming pool and the suburbia, right? There's been some proposals to create whole new cities. There's one in the East Bay in Northern California that some wealthy tech people from Silicon Valley have sort of floated the idea of, let's just create a new city from scratch in agricultural land sort of east of the Bay Area, right? But again, environmentalists don't want that, right? So there's environmental pressures. There's good reasons for a lot of these laws that were developed in order to prevent environmental degradation and such, but it makes it expensive. The environmental regulations is a big part of it. It creates delay. And I would also say the power of labor unions in California. So if you're a home builder, you have to pay what's called prevailing wage to construction workers, which is just going to be, it's significantly higher in California than construction work costs in red states, including Texas, right? So the costs are cumulatively add up. Another one, we care about climate policy in the state. Talk about environment in a minute. If you're building a new house in California, you have to put solar panels in the house, right? That adds about $20,000 in cost to a new house. You might recoup it down the road, hopefully, but just like to get into a new house is expensive for a lot of different cumulative reasons.
So, Shoshana, you and I have both kind of fallen in love with the same book, this Ezra Klein book on abundance. And I guess my question is, having gone through this, there's a discussion really about housing and about kind of environmental policy, in particular the sort of the transition to green energy. I'm curious, just one, to get your thoughts on the book, if you think this is kind of inaccurate. And then I guess my second question on this is, well, let me come back to my second question. So I'll let you, summarize a bit and what you think about this as, sort of a thesis going forward.
Yeah, so books about public policy don't usually make it onto the Amazon top 5 best sellers list. It was actually really hard for me to get a copy of this book because it's so in demand. If you haven't read Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, highly recommend. Take a quick note. Many of you have probably already heard of it because it's basically gone viral. I'm still waiting for any of my books about public policy to go viral. But the basic argument, these are two progressive guys, but they really say the left has gotten it wrong. And the left, blue states like California have, which Ken points out correctly that it's not always been blue, but nonetheless, a lot of the choices made by policymakers in states like California have been a deliberate choice for scarcity. They have restricted the supply of housing over decades to the point that they've basically engineered our housing crisis. And so specifically, what are they talking about? Partly it's single family, housing zoning laws, but they also point to CEQA, which Ken mentioned earlier, the California Environmental Quality Act of 1970, which was actually signed by a Republican governor, Ronald Reagan. And it's also regulations favoring, small female-owned, minority-owned businesses that may not be the most productive builders of housing, and that's just one more thing that it's a valid goal, but it's increasing the cost of housing. So there's dozens of these things, and the book goes through all of these and is really compelling. One of the images that that really gripped me from this book was they say, if you walk around like the Bay Area and every other home has a Black Lives Matter sign in front of it, but it's all zoned for single families, which has effectively excluded minority communities from the area, right? So they say we need to choose abundance instead of scarcity, and it's just a really compelling read.
So I'm going to ask a follow-up question we didn't actually prep, but feel free either of you. Just I'm going to go a bit rogue.
Going
here.
rogue.
I'm going rogue. So I was reading over break the biography of Milton Friedman, right? The Lisa Burns biography. It's just fantastic. I also highly recommend. What's interesting about that is she talks a lot about his writing, kind of Free to Choose, which was the big policy book of the 70s. And it hit at just the right time. People were looking for sort of a solution, but also the Republicans had kind of been shellacked in sort of recent elections. And this gave a particular purple state governor known as Ronald Reagan an answer to a lot of questions that gave him something to run on other than anti-communism. Now, it was not on my bingo card that Ezra Klein would be the new Milton Friedman, but my question to you is, who's the Ronald Reagan? Because it seems like, is it Josh Shapiro? Is it, I mean, it doesn't seem like it's Gavin Newsom. Ryan's too young, right?
Newsom's tacking hard to the center, so maybe he's going to pull it
Maybe
off.
it's
But
Newsom?
he's got a long record to live down. I don't know what.
Ken, what do you think? Is there a blue state?
No, it's not a blue state. It's a red state Democratic governor, I think would be the best chance.
So we're still holding out hope for Steve Bullock?
Steve Bullock, right? You know, or a purple state, you know, Shapiro would be someone like that, right?
Because it does strike me somebody's going to have to pick this up, right? That it's not going to be the power of a New York Times columnist, just like it wasn't the power of a Nobel Prize winning economist.
I don't know. It's a bestseller.
Fair.
Everybody here's going to read it now.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really good.
So I want to turn, Shauna, just one more question on housing, which is the link, and you kind of mentioned this briefly, but is this link between homelessness and sort of housing? And I think there's a lot of narratives out there that this is, you know, caused by mental illness, drug addiction, and so on. And I guess my question is, you know, is there some, you know, magic policy that will sort of fix homelessness, or is this really a housing problem? Or is this just a manifestation of the abundance?
It is largely a housing problem, yeah. As the signs around Claremont say, housing ends homelessness. It is largely a housing problem. So there are all of these alternative theories, as Eric mentioned. You know, maybe it's mental illness, maybe it's our strong social safety net. But if you go through and inspect all of the evidence, you know, maybe it's our nice weather, none of it actually empirically stands up to close scrutiny, right? And so one helpful contrast would be Houston, right? Houston has nice weather. It actually has warmer winters than we do, but they've almost solved the problem of homelessness. Cost of housing is really low in Houston relative to most of California. It's not mental health because Hawaii, my home state, has one of the best mental health sort of indexes in the country, but a massive homelessness problem. And so no matter what other sort of smoking gun you try to find, you just always come back to it's a problem of availability of housing and high cost of housing.
Ken, I want to turn to you for a last topic. I know we're running a little bit long, so I want to make sure we have time for questions. But you know, this is the one that you would suspect. This is the number one leader in solar energy is California. What you might not expect is that Texas is number two. And what's interesting to me is when you go to wind, it's definitely Texas, not an obviously windier spot than, say, coastal California, for anyone who's been in the hills around the coast. And so I guess my question to you is, why is Texas overtaking California as the green energy leader? I thought this was the land of oil derricks and people with big Stetson hats driving cars with horns on them.
Yeah, it's because money can be made.
Why, Ken? Why can money be made?
Money can be made in electricity, right? And this is not driven by regulation. In California, it's the state pursuing policies that are mandating a conversion to non-carbon fuels. That's absolutely not happening in Texas. Texas loves oil and gas. Texas has doubled down on extraction of fossil fuels through fracking, right? So as a matter of public policy, Texas loves fossil fuels, but they love money even more, right? And if there's money to be made in generating electricity from solar and wind, there are entrepreneurs and business people in Texas who are going to want to make that happen, right? And the wind, right? So the wind in California is largely coastal. There's also some wind zones in somewhat sensitive canyon areas and such. But there's a lot of environmental concerns about wind turbines. Most of the wind power generated in Texas is out in the plains in West Texas, where there's a steady wind supply, but there's not a whole lot of population nearby, and they just don't have the same environmental concerns. Not in the same sort of environmental sensitive areas, but also just the ideology around environmentalism. So I would say that's it, that Texas sees itself as an all-in, all-energy producing state. They take a lot of pride in that, and a lot of people are saying, let's diversify beyond oil and gas into these other sectors and become like the energy producer for the country. So that's a short answer.
Just a quick kind of follow-up. It also strikes me that we're in a weird place where solar and natural gas are complementary, and we in California have really tried to avoid fossil fuels of any kind. And it's an interesting feature of this that when the sun goes down, you can turn on the natural gas plant. It's much more difficult to do that with sort of other renewables, and battery technology is just not quite there yet. So this is me taking off the moderator hat for 1 second and saying I 100% agree with you, but it is an interesting feature of this that also that embrace of fossil fuels actually complements what we have now as a really declining cost curve energy production in solar. Sean, I'm going to give you the last energy question, which is just state mandates on carbon. And this one, not to give away my own opinion on this, but I've always found this strange since the planet really doesn't care sort of if California or West Virginia sort of emits the carbon, it still goes up in the atmosphere.
Right.
But I'm curious, what's the sort of motivation behind these, and what is kind of the downside of these carbon targets at the state level?
So first of all, you've clearly taken off the moderator hat.
Yeah, it's gone.
Ken owes me $5. Yeah, I would say that around the globe, actually, one of the main reasons that carbon markets and carbon taxes and so forth have not lived up to their potential is the problem of firm exit, and that's not a unique problem to the United States. But when you try to do reduce greenhouse gas emissions at a state level, let alone a country level, it gets to be even more problematic where you get carbon leakage. And so yeah, there's some initial evidence that when California or the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative on the East Coast tries to kind of reduce carbon emissions in that area, you do get some firm exit, and it ends up in states with dirtier, less regulation, and therefore maybe dirtier in the long run. It's just one of the drawbacks of environmental federalism. It would be a lot more productive to do this at the national level, but it doesn't seem like that's going to happen anytime soon. So this is what we are left with.
So I have two more questions, and I'm going to open it up to the audience for sort of questions. And my first question would be, why do we see that? I mean, I think we've pretty conclusively sort of talked through the big policy differences, some of which are causing this migration being really housing, right? With kind of a secondary, sort of taxes and, the people not sort of valuing the public spending as much, particularly sort of on education. Why do we, and can you hint at this with unions, the role of unions in sort of this process and moving states to sort of, that had previously been red, purple, moving them to be blue? I guess what I want to ask is, how much of this is driven by kind of politics, economics, culture, kind of broad trends that we sort of see, right? Is there something, there's kind of the perpetual hope that Texas will turn blue among progressives, witness enormous amounts of money given to Beto. But I'm curious, like,
So there's this dream, this progressive dream that Texas will turn blue, and there's like a basis for that, which is a demographic theory of politics, which is to say, as a state becomes more racially, ethnically diverse, it's more likely to become democratic. And that was actually seemed to happen in California. As the state became much more racially, ethnically diverse, it became democratic, whereas before it was overwhelmingly white and it was Republican, right? And so people look at California and they say, oh, that's the model. As a state becomes more diverse, it becomes democratic. And the fact of the matter is, Texas is almost exactly as diverse as California. It's one of, I think, half a dozen majority-minority states in the United States. It has the exact same percentage Hispanic population as California, 40% of California, 40% of Texas is Hispanic. There's a larger African-American percentage population in Texas than in California. And so you would say, oh, we're prime, we're ready. And this was like sort of during the Obama era, sort of this new coalition building. And so Texas is going to be part of that. And there's a lot of high expectation with Beto O'Rourke and others that Texas was about ready to flip. So it hasn't, and it doesn't look like it's moving in that direction. So I would say that demography is not necessarily destiny, that there are other factors in play. And so the things that I think about are economics. So the economics of Texas include a necessity that it be a low-cost state. In order to attract business, businesses are not moving to Texas because of the climate or the beauty of the state, right? Or even the amenities. They're not moving from California to Texas for that. They're moving there because it's a more business-friendly state with lower taxes, less regulation. And so that's the political leadership of Texas believes it is essential for us to maintain that economic fiscal policy. And that's a Republican-oriented policy agenda, lower taxes, less regulation, okay? So the politics of the state reinforce and are reinforced by the economics. Another one is political culture. So California, historically, even though it was Republican, was pretty progressive. It was a big part of the progressive movement. And there was this environmental movement in California that goes back more than 100 years. And so when California gravitated to the Democratic Party, the modern Democratic Party, it was just sort of aligning with a party that embraced those values, whereas Texas, which had been historically Democratic and conservative, aligned with the conservative party, which is the Republican Party today, right? So there's a number of different factors that come into play, labor unions, sort of the underlying political culture, the economy, a lot of different things that explain why these states have sorted out the way they have.
So I'm not sure how the moderators would like to do this, but my understanding is there are mics on the side, but I'm gonna ask one more question to Sean while people are lining up. So should we do that? We'll have them line up. And then I'll ask you the last question because I know we took a little bit of extra time. My last question is just, how does national politics affect this? I mean, we're in this era with the Trump administration. What's the sort of effect of national politics on this?
Do you mean like Trump administration policies, for example? Like
Yeah.
how will they affect the red-blue?
Yeah, the blue state divide. What do you project the future?
Well, I can't talk about all of them. It's tempting to try to talk about immigration and tariffs. They'll have such interesting effects on different states. I will take an example that's close to my own heart, which is Medicaid. One of the big things going on in DC right now, if you've been following the news at all, you know that their Republican leaders in Congress are trying to find money to pay for Trump's tax cuts. And they need to cut, depending on which bill you're looking at, they're looking for about $1.5 trillion in cuts. They are saying as of now that they have no plans to cut Medicaid, but it's really hard to cut $1.5 trillion from the budget without touching entitlement programs. So, the question is, if the Trump administration cuts funding for Medicaid, how will that affect red versus blue states? And at first glance, it might seem really bad news for the blue states because they, as we saw earlier, have been disproportionately the ones to do the Medicaid expansion. They have much bigger programs. But one thing that's interesting is that actually you hear the loudest screaming going on right now in Congress from Republican senators. And there are 3 states in particular, Missouri, Oklahoma, and South Dakota. I think those are the 3, right? That really dragged their feet on the Medicaid expansion, didn't want to do it. Republican lawmakers weren't into it. And so it became a ballot measure that got passed, sort of, progressive groups did an end run around the legislature. And it ended up in constitutional amendments, which are going to be extremely hard to reverse. That would take years to reverse. So there are a handful of red states that are really going to be extremely adversely affected if the federal government suddenly announces we're not going to spend as much on the Medicaid expansion populations, which was 90%. And so it's really interesting political dynamics right now with a lot of red states that are going to be just as badly hurt, if not more so, than the blue states. So it'll be interesting to keep an eye on that. That's just one example. Maybe people will have questions about other Trump policies and how those will affect red versus blue states.
And with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. Do you want me to, there you go, Noor.
Nur Yilmaz.
Oh, thank you.
I'm a freshman. My name is Nur Yilmaz, and I had the privilege of taking Professor Helen's Econ 50 class.
You're too kind.
So in that class, he actually noted a bunch of stuff on like minimum wage, especially in its tying into basically mobility and like labor markets, which sort of, essentially leads to socioeconomic mobility in like the long run. So the question I have is like, how does the current labor market mobility, but also like the social mobility aspects within the states that we've examined, shape long-term economic inequality? Or even, can we measure this, or does this matter to a person choosing to move between California and Texas? Is this a deal breaker for people who want to move?
Sounds like an Econ 50 question to me.
Oh, no. He knows, no, go ahead. And then I promise I'll chime in.
Yeah, I'll take a stab sort of at the general topic as to things like minimum wage or other subsidies for people at the low end of the economic spectrum. I mean, I think it's probably more important in a place like California to have those kinds of income supports because it's so expensive to live here, right? If you're in a low-cost place, then you can probably get by with fewer sort of welfare support or social services or a higher minimum wage. And those are different models, right? And I think it would be much more difficult to get by in California if you didn't have sort of higher wage structure that we've built in to the state in order to pay for the high cost of living.
So I'm just going to take off the moderator hat completely and cost you $5, Ken. But I think one of the interesting answers to Nur's questions is we've historically moved people to high productivity states because of sort of the wage gains, right? Not engineered those through minimum wages or subsidies. And I do think this is one of the things that worries me about this red state, blue state model is that as we've moved away from abundant housing or denser housing and things like that, we've really short-circuited a path to upward mobility that moving to a low productivity state because you can't afford the housing.
Right. I was going to draw in the research of Raj Chetty, another economist who came and visited the Athenaeum a few years ago, probably before many of you were here. Raj Chetty, who was a classmate of mine in graduate school, has all this research on social mobility and finds that place really matters. Your zip code really matters. And so to the extent that and this goes back to the abundance book, to the extent that our scarcity policies are turning California into a luxury good that only the wealthy can afford, we are cutting off social mobility to low-income people who used to be able to afford California and now have to leave for other states with less economic opportunity. So I actually think the housing policies are just as detrimental to social mobility as social safety net type programs or regulations, minimum wages, things like that.
Thank you.
Hey there. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm Caleb. I'm a freshman here at CMC. So I found the tax discussion particularly fascinating, and especially when it came to the graph showing that in Texas, lower income people spend a higher share of or contribute a higher share of their income towards taxes. And the one tax category that didn't get as much discussion was sales taxes. Yeah. And I imagine that contributes partially to that discrepancy because lower income people are able to save less, and so they spend a higher share of their income. So I'm curious what kind of the state of sales taxes are around the nation and how that contributes to these phenomena.
We had a slide on sales tax and it got cut. We have about 50 extra slides because we were so excited to talk about so many things, and we decided to take it out. But you're absolutely right. It's a big reason why states like Texas have relatively regressive tax structures because lower income people spend a larger percentage of their resources on, you know, household items and so forth. So yeah, that's a great point, and one that we would have made if we had another hour.
I'll just add one thing on that. What's interesting about that, Professor Rose made this point about volatility. So in California, sales tax is actually the least volatile as well. So one of the interesting features of this is that you rely on it. It's more regressive, but it also means that Texas has a pretty stable revenue stream because the housing price swing is not as dramatic. So even if California had a much higher property tax, it would still have some volatility due to housing prices. So it's an interesting feature of sales taxes is that they're quite stable, particularly if you label them on things that low-income people buy more of. You know, the trade-off.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Deborah. You guys know me. But so actually, I wanted to ask about Trump's tariff policy because we talk a lot about economic factors, and obviously California and Texas have different economies. And we've obviously heard a lot about these countries imposing tariffs that would target industries in red states. And so I guess I'm wondering if we think like California's survival might incentivize people moving back because like the economy will be less affected by these tariffs.
So I'll let you take a stab at it. But I'm curious, just like very locally, about the effect of tariffs because a big part of this region's economy, the Inland Empire area, is logistics based on imports from Asia through the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles, and we've moved from housing construction being the biggest economic driver in this region to warehouses. Right, and so warehouses depend critically on an import economy, and so I'm sure there's going to be all sorts of effects if these tariffs actually are implemented over the long run on trade and also domestic industry and such. But I think you can't necessarily predict whether it's going to be a red state or a blue state dominant effect. I don't know.
No, I 100% agree. Did you want to add anything to that?
I would just say that I do think that proximity matters in trade, and so you do see sort of the border states to Mexico and Canada perhaps being, you know, to the extent that trade wars escalate with our nearest partners, you will see states like California, Arizona, Texas, and, you know, and that's blue and red states disproportionately affected. And then, of course, there are industries that will suffer that may be concentrated in red states, you know, where there's more manufacturing. But I think all states will suffer.
I would only add one thing to this. So 100% agree. The only thing I would add is one way to think about tariffs is they're an incredibly regressive sales tax, right? That is that the idea here is, and this is where Trump's policies just sort of make no sense whatsoever, right? Because if you're going to bring manufacturing back, the only way you do it is raise prices such that domestic manufacturers come back in. I think what you're going to see, and I haven't seen a lot of discussion on this, is a lot of pressure to reduce state sales taxes in the face of those price increases.
Yeah.
And so I think the one thing that people sort of aren't thinking about, it's certainly going to cause a hit to income. I don't know what the hit to sort of high income people is going to be. That's harder to predict, but I do think it's going to be a big increase in a lot of commodities that sort of people rely on, right? And that's going to put a lot of pressure on places like Texas to go after, you know, we were talking about this very stable sort of revenue stream. So I think one thing that hasn't been thought through is a lot of red states rely very heavily on sales taxes, and you're going to see a tremendous push for people to get some relief from this sort of increase. And I'm going to be very curious to sort of see how that plays out because I think it's going to be very painful. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm Scott. I'm a junior at CMC from Portland, Oregon, and I'm curious about which states, if any, that are experiencing population decline might be reversing course on some of the progressive policy choices that they've made that promote scarcity, and what policy areas those might fall under.
Have you finished the book? I'm only halfway through.
I finished the book.
Okay, so
Yeah.
tell us about
Yeah,
the abundance agenda, and is it working?
So I put Sean on the spot with my Milton Friedman analogy.
I'm getting you back.
I totally deserve it. But I really think the answer is no one at the moment, right? That is, you know, there's the other book, the person that unfortunately got eclipsed by Ezra Klein, was a book called Why Nothing Works. And he has this great story that they called him in Portland to come out and give them some advice on how to sort of increase housing. And they said, the person said, well, but we don't have any anti-housing policies. They said, well, don't you have a policy that says you can't build anything that obstructs the view of Mount Rainier? Well, yeah, but that's not an anti-housing policy. And he goes through this list about a dozen things that you can't do in Portland. The net effect, you can't build anything in Portland. So I think at this point, what needs to happen is Ken says it's going to be a red state Democrat, but we'll make this hypothetically someone like, I don't know, governor of Montana or something like that, who might be interested in doing this. But I think it's going to have to be someone who grabs onto that. In the same way that Reagan, there's a story that Reagan could draw out the Milton Friedman graph of the money supply on a napkin to sort of as a party trick. And I think you need someone like that who says the solution to these problems is this painful thing that unions aren't going to like, that environmental groups aren't going to like, but we have to do it. And I don't know if it's possible in a world where you never want to say something bad about another member of the Democratic coalition, right? It's really going to take somebody saying, in one of these states, this chunk of the coalition is not going to get what they want, and we're sort of going to make them mad. And that was, for Reagan, that was kind of the Rockefeller Republicans, right? And they sort of pushed them out. So I watch this space. If I were giving advice to anyone looking for sort of a political candidate to back, it's going to be a 50-50 election for a long time until somebody does this. And then I think it's probably going to be a much more popular agenda, but it's going to take some real political courage. And, it'd be really interesting to find that person and work on their staff, or just join California YIMBY.
All right, thank you.
That's your cue.
Hey, professors, thank you for your talk. I think my question is actually a good follow-up to that one, which is a bit more about why that abundance initiative hasn't necessarily played out in California, even though there are New York Times best-selling books about it now, and it's very much so in the air. And I know, Professor Miller, you talked a bit about labor unions having a lot of power in California. I think the Building Trades Association is one that comes up a lot, and the environmental groups like the Sierra Club having a long-standing political history in the state. But I'm curious to know whether you think that other organized labor groups like CTA or other unions that just represent kind of everyday workers in California are going to eventually kind of turn against unions that are essentially adding a tax onto the cost of living for their everyday workers. There's only so much they can do with cost of living adjustments before a CTA member just can't afford to live in California anymore and buy that $900,000 house. So I'd be interested to know, are we going to see a break in that coalition like Professor Heller mentioned anytime soon?
Yeah, so I'm a skeptic until I see it. There's a dynamic that we have in the country, which we haven't really talked about, is one-party government, also known as trifectas, where you have the governor and both houses of the legislature controlled by one party. And in states like California, it's like a 3/4 Democratic control. And it's very difficult for a dominant party to try to change its ways, because it's got very entrenched interest groups, the groups, right, which are part of that coalition, and to try to move a coalition that's so dominant in a different direction. I mean, I think it would be easier if you had a very competitive situation and the Democratic Party was concerned about losing power. So I think actually there might be more hope at a national Democratic level, where in terms of a presidential election and thinking about congressional races, are we going to try to reposition something along the lines that that Ezra Klein's talking about, or and maybe challenge some of the long-held assumptions of members of our coalition in order to try to provide something that the American people are desperate for, which is actually good governance, right? And I think probably the Trump experiment's going to crash and burn, and there's going to be an opportunity for somebody to emerge that's going to have reasonable answers. And I think the Democrats have an opportunity, but they're just so disabled by internal party politics that it's going to be difficult for them to do that.
No, I totally agree. I mean, there's no need for new ideas or compromise when you have not only the governor and both chambers of the state legislature in your party's control and all the interest groups supporting you, but you also have a supermajority. You know, a lot of states have that, and it's a product of polarization, partisan polarization, geographical polarization, where, 40 years ago, most states had divided government. It's just not the case anymore. So I'm also very skeptical. I'm sorry that we're sort of concluding on a depressing note here.
I'm going to go optimistic.
Oh, good.
I'm going to go optimistic. I'm an economist. Literally, you've just heard words of wisdom from two political scientists. You should believe nothing I'm about to say, but here goes. I actually think, Ryan, and I mean this not to embarrass you, but you're the future. No, I think the reality is, Ryan, that look, since we're not recording this, oh wait, we are recording this. I think the interesting thing about the Bernie Sanders coalition is it has a point, right? What's the typical Bernie bro, right? It's someone who sort of accumulated student loan debt, sort of got a degree that sort of doesn't sort of keep them in a middle class lifestyle. It's the politics of downward mobility. And look what it wants, right? It wants student loan debt forgiveness, right? They want Medicare for all, right? This is not gold to my ear Wisconsin socialism anymore, right? This is basically prop up my slide into downward mobility. The thing about it is, like Trumponomics, it's not going to work, right? You can't redistribute your way out of that. And what would work is the abundance agenda. So I think your job, as you sort of go to work for EMB, is to basically take care of the neo-Brandeisians, right? Because what's the argument, right? There's a group of Elizabeth Warrenites within the Democratic Party who are part of intra-elite competition, right? They're basically saying, you don't have to make any hard choices, it's just corporate greed. And the problem is, that's actually not the problem, right? And so the lack of housing abundance is not due to corporate greed. The lack of housing abundance is due to all the things that my colleagues have been talking about. So I think people like you saying, look, that thing that's a real movement, right, that's behind Bernie Sanders, this downward mobility, to say that answer isn't going to help you, but this answer might, and to take on the people who kind of want to hold the coalition together because it's some sort of elite competition. I mean, I think that's what we sort of need more of, right? And so, fight the good fight, because I kind of think at some point, right, the amount of redistribution that you have to do to keep that coalition together, to keep the unions happy, right, to keep the teachers in housing, it's going to crush this state. And so absent somebody sort of coming along, and it's going to have to be somebody who's not 45 or 50 and well entrenched in Democratic politics, it's going to have to be somebody who has relatively little to lose and can move out of the state when everybody gets mad at them, just hypothetically. So I'm kidding when I say you're the future, but I'm not. I think this is kind of really the way that this gets changed is to prevent a viable alternative. And it's not crazed libertarian wacko Professor Helen saying, all we need is free markets, right? That's not going to cut it in California. Professor Miller's right. But saying we really have to build housing because low-income people can't live here, and against all other versions of their economic interest, they're moving to Texas, where they don't have health care, where their taxes are higher. Can you imagine how big the housing disparity has to be to say, well, I had basically free health care in California, and there was a subsidized education system that was at least as good as Texas, and you know what? I'm leaving. And I don't know how many young people I know that are doing that. So yeah, so I'll give the hopeful answer. I think it's you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your time and insights tonight. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone else did as well. It's at this time that we would like to conclude the ATH services for the night. That being said, if we could kind of make haste to the back of the ATH lobby area, our student workers, our lovely student workers are going to clean up, but I'm sure they have papers and tests to study for. So thank you so much. Get home safe, and have a great rest of your night.
Thank you all.